Hey everyone, welcome back to the Jacobin Show. I'm Jen Pan, and I'm here with Paul Prescod. Paul, what's on your mind?
Not much, Marco Rubio's on my mind as always.
Yes,
I was.
Marco,
Oh no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, for anyone who hasn't seen the news yet, Marco Rubio, friend of the worker, has recently come
Right.
out in support of the Amazon union. LaborPaul, how do we feel about that?
Well, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I was a little skeptical when he said they were going to become a working class party, but this proves, he wasn't all talk. Yeah, of course I'm kidding. If you actually read the letter, Rubio basically just hates Amazon because of the culture war. Amazon went a little too far in offending quote unquote conservative values or workers' values, which he's posing as conservative values. And that's why he's very tenuously supporting Amazon workers.
I think for me, the real kicker of the piece is several paragraphs in, he says something like, well, like I support the Amazon union because we definitely want to support workers who are resisting tyrannical woke CEO.
Hmm.
And so in conclusion, we must oppose the PRO Act. Like
Right.
gold.
And there's a line in there where he's like, I'm not sure if this union drive is being pushed by the Democratic Party or by workers. Like, I'm not sure if it's the workers doing this or the Democrats, but yeah, it's just incredible.
When he was talking about the Amazon's woke culture wars, did you happen to click on any of the links in the article to like the books controversy or anything like that?
I didn't. I should have, but I didn't do that.
So I clicked on the books because I wanted to see what the book uproar was about. Apparently Amazon removed like anti-transgender book called When Harry Became Sally off of their website.
Mm,
And apparently Marco Rubio is under the impression that this is why workers in Alabama are
right.
organizing.
Right. I love how, yeah, he's assuming that these workers are like paying attention to this crap and like
Hmm.
that's why they want a union.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's
So
incredible.
So on this show, you and I in particular have talked about different strains of so-called right-wing populism before.
Hmm.
And, I think that we are in agreement and we've always been really clear that there really is no pro-worker conservative movement. Like obviously, as we've discussed before, the Republican Party itself is extremely hostile to any kind of worker power. And or anything that goes against business, really. So I'm just wondering what you think of this recent kind of wave of, as you pointed out earlier, Marco Rubio sort of doubling down on this rhetoric. The Amazon article he wrote kind of seemed like him trying to make a second hard hat riot happen or something. And
Right.
there's that guy Orrin Cass who's part of American Compass, which is the conservative pro-worker conservative think tank that Marco Rubio is also associated with. And I just feel like lately they've been popping up again. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on like the recent resurgence.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Nixon because at least Nixon was good at it. Like he was good at ginning this stuff up. But I think what's even more annoying to me, like, look, Trump is going to do this, Rubio's going to do this, the politicians, but like, what's actually more insidious is these think tanks like Orrin Cass and American Compass they're trying to craft like an ideological, justification for this. And it's amazing. I've been reading some articles from American Compass, which is this like new, I think it's new. It's a new right wing think tank that's trying to craft this new pro worker conservative agenda. Orrin Cass, who used to be like an advisor to Mitt Romney, that populist working class hero, Mitt
Yeah.
Romney. And when you read it, I listened to Orrin Cass. I think he was on actually Sagar and Jetty's podcast. I think, I'm listening to him and he goes, we don't have a problem with unions. We just, we don't like public sector unions. We don't like the way current private sector unions operate. And it's like, okay, so you just don't like actually existing unions and you like this fantasy version of unions that they want that cooperates with management, of course. So it's really, you can just see how hollow it is when you really
Hmm.
start looking into it. And the vast majority of workers today are in public sector unions. That's just a fact. The private sector, has been decimated. So when you say like, well, I don't like public sector unions and you want to cherry pick, you're basically leaving out most actually existing unions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, following from that, something that Marco Rubio said in his piece, which Oren Cass says a lot as well, is we support unions insofar as we don't like it when labor and management are adversarial with each other. They use that word adversarial a lot. Like it seems like they view unions insofar as they support them as kind of like a wing of HR, like something that is only good insofar as, you know, as you say, reduces friction between management and labor. And like that's bullshit. And on that note, I want to read a quote from the labor historian Joshua Freeman, who's somebody I interviewed for an article last year. And he has a really fantastic line that I think just sums up the problem with this sort of pro-worker, like conservative outlook perfectly. So I'm going to pull that up. So he writes, or he said, some conservatives may want to treat workers well or may even want to use state power to improve the lives of workers, but unionism is about worker power. If you're giving workers some say over what happens on the shop floor, in the office, or in the service center, you're limiting the discretionary power of the employer, and it's pretty hard to find a conservative that actually wants to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, it's very telling because when you read Oren Cass in American Compass, he actually is specific about the model he wants. And he talks about the Works Council model in Germany. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's kind of complicated, but the idea there is that workers have a seat at the table. They collaborate with management. They help the company out. And that actually hasn't, especially over time, and as, you know, neoliberalism has advanced everywhere, that hasn't been working out very well. And these are kind of token seats that workers have. But that's kind of the vision that they want in this country, is that mm-hmm. labor is cooperating. And in Rubio's letter, it's just amazing where it's like, you know, the workplace should not be adversarial, as if every workplace every day without a union is adversarial. It's just one-sided, you know?
Right, exactly.
It's adversarial by its very nature. So they just don't like it being adversarial the other way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like their vision of the workplace not being adversarial, like completely misunderstands the wage relation and also just how employment law in the US works, where your boss your boss like actually has all the power.
Right.
Well, on that note, I know you have some good news related to pensions. This is some good union news. So take it away.
Yeah. So we're going to do the usual good cop, bad cop, where I'm the good cop and Jen comes in as a bad cop. But so last week, the American Rescue Plan Act passed, which has triggered a range of actions from across the political spectrum. Some progressives are fawning and calling this the second coming of FDR and the first coming of social democracy in America. And certain aspects of the bill are gobbling up all the attention, like the $1,400 stimulus checks, the child tax credits, and the absence of a minimum wage hike. And the president and vice president are right now going on a tour to promote all the benefits.
President Joe Biden stopped by a flooring company in Chester, Pennsylvania on Tuesday to personally promote his $1.9 trillion stimulus package as part of an all-out push by his team to sell his massive plan aimed at revving up the U.S. economy.
You should be aware more help is on the way for real.
Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, First Lady Jill Biden, and others are visiting various states and appearing on television as part of what the White House is calling the Help Is Here tour, aimed to coincide with Americans receiving their $1,400 stimulus checks as part of the bill.
So President Biden, you'll remember a while back, he said, help is on the way. And then he signed that American Rescue Plan, so I would say, help is here. Help is here. Help is here.
But something is in there that isn't getting the attention it deserves and represents a huge victory for working people. Of the $1.9 trillion in the bill, $83 billion goes towards saving the pensions of over 1 million workers. The U.S. Treasury Department will rescue the Central States Pension Fund in the form of grants that don't have to be repaid. Pensioners will get 100% of their earned benefits. 400,000 of these workers are Teamsters, and they are ecstatic at this victory. The Central States Pension Fund, which covers not only Teamsters, but workers in other sectors like construction and hospitality, was in crisis well before COVID due to a variety of compounding factors. I recently spoke with Ken Paff about these developments. Ken is the national organizer of Teamsters for a Democratic Union, a rank-and-file reform movement within the Teamsters Union, and has been very active in the fight to save pensions. Here's what Ken had to say about the origins of this pension crisis.
Well, so many funds got into this position when you, with union busting, deunionization, you don't have enough active workers contributing into your plan. And you start having more retirees than actives. The employer pays in on the actives. It would be as if we didn't have any people working anymore in the United States and we still had to pay Social Security. And in some countries like Japan with a baby bust, that's going to be a problem. Well, what if in union busting, that problem is greatly exaggerated? And in the Central States Plan, it was unfortunately greatly exacerbated, self-inflicted by the Teamsters leadership and the Hoppe administration. Short-sighted political moves, accommodation to the largest employer, the largest, most profitable transport corporation in the world, United Parcel Service, was allowed to leave the pension plan on December 31, 2007. What happened a few months later? They said, don't worry, because UPS is leaving the fund, but they have to give us the withdrawal liability of $6 billion. It's super duper, a big present here on New Year's Eve. Within months, the fund had lost $11 billion when Wall Street crashed the economy in 2008. So now you had deunionization and failure to bring members into the plan. You had pulling out the giant profitable employer that was really necessary in the plan. And you had Wall Street crashing the economy. At that point, the fate of the Central States Fund was set, as it will go bankrupt. And it's gone down since then. It's now 5 years from bankruptcy.
So with the pension fund already weakened, Congress went in for the kill. In December 2014, with no public hearings or debate, in the middle of the night, slipped in as part of an omnibus appropriations bill, Congress passed the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act. This bill allowed for dramatic pension cuts, up to 60% of benefits for retirees enrolled in plans that were in financial trouble.
It's difficult to imagine the collective knots in these stomachs finding out by letters sent by the Central States Pension Fund that its financial emergency is being passed on to them. Retired trucker Dennis Germain is in disbelief.
And they said that if we give up our pay raises, the money gained, we'd be better off putting it in the pension fund.
Billy Scott drove a car hauler for 27 years.
You work all your life and you base your retirement on what they tell you you're going to get. So I set up my life to survive on what they told me I was going to get. Now they're going to cut me 52%. I'll lose my car, lose my health care.
We'll lose our homes, our cars, our medical, it's going to get down to where will you buy food or will you buy your needed prescriptions? It's going to devastate everybody.
Central States Pension Fund's going broke. Its website saying it's asked Congress for permission to execute a pension rescue after its lobbyists were able to get Congress to exempt it from normal pension rules, preventing this kind of cutting. The local Teamsters are trying to get Congress to overturn a last-minute 2014 vote.
I'm trying to make arrangements so that come July, the bottom doesn't fall out.
Yeah, I could go back to work, I guess, for what, being a greeter at Walmart?
So let's take a step back and talk about what pensions are and what the average one looks like. Pensions are workers' deferred pay. They worked for them. They put away money and paid into them already. They are not a handout. On average, the amount is about $15,000 per beneficiary. This is a modest benefit, some level of security after a life of hard work. But with the passage of the act in 2014, Teamsters retirees sprung into action. And as Ken Paff puts it, it was the movement that the Teamsters led to defend their pensions that secured this victory in the latest stimulus bill.
At that point, when it became very clear where it was headed, in 2013, we launched this pension movement through TDU. And it pretty quickly grew up and became independent of TDU. It took on its own life. The pension movement across the country, I mean, groups would spring up in South Texas and in Atlanta and in Minnesota and Kansas City and Detroit, all across the Midwest and the South, everywhere. There were pension committees, and they organized into the National United Committee to Protect Pensions. And that movement went on all these years since then. And, you know, to be honest, Did I think they were going to win 100% with no reductions? Well, that was our goal, but let's put it this way. We kind of expected this is going to end up with some compromise.
Right.
And they were talking to senators like Grassley, and he was the lead Republican. He's going to help you. He was actually the person who made the motion this month in the Senate to defeat this bill. That amendment was voted down in the middle of the night by a vote of 49 to 50 against, by a party line vote. So right then, right before this bill passed, they tried to take out this clause. And they'll probably try to chip away with it in the future, but I think they're not going to be able to do it. So it was really a grassroots movement that became a marathon that stuck with it all that time. And of course, we had allies. And as I say, eventually Teamster leadership became an ally. Early on, the machinists were a good ally. We have to give credit to our friends, the Pension Rights Center, a wonderful nonprofit group in Washington, D.C. that was with us from day one and that enlisted allies like the AARP. So we had allies, and but really the credit goes to the pensionistas that really made it happen. In 2017, we finally got a bill introduced by Bernie Sanders called COPPA, Keep Our Pension Promises Act. And it was the solution we wanted. Within a year, it was replaced by another bill, and really the lead person was Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, and that was the Butch-Lewis Act. And we're proud that the bill that just passed and was signed into law by President Biden, the Butch-Lewis Act, is named after one of our TDU leaders, Butch Lewis, who was on our TDU International Steering Committee, was a leader in Local 100 in Cincinnati. And he was a real stalwart in the pension movement. And up to the very day he died, he was working hard to pass this bill. And his widow, Rita Lewis, continued on in this fight, spoke at many rallies and so on. And it's people like him, it's named after him, but there were a lot of people like that who made it happen.
This movement encompassed cities all around the country, and it was thanks to their tireless activism that this issue was kept alive in the public consciousness and the halls of power. But we aren't out of the woods yet on pensions. Despite how significant this victory is, it is still in many ways a short-term solution. Defined benefit pensions are quickly becoming a thing of the past for private sector workers, with less than 15% receiving them today. These pensions guarantee workers a lifetime benefit based on their salary and years of service. Employers increasingly use defined contribution plans like 401ks, which put workers in the precarious position of depending on a volatile stock market to keep their benefits safe. Millennials often joke that retirement and pensions won't exist when we need them, except it's not really a joke. It's a pretty realistic assessment of the balance of forces. And this is certainly the future the ruling class wants to bring into being, but it doesn't have to be this way. We can create a sustainable pension system that gives all workers a dignified and secure retirement. This is what Ken Paff had to say about that.
And this is an issue that's been raised by Bernie Sanders and others, that our Social Security is inadequate. I mean, it's a great plan, and it's progressive, and it really helps eliminate old age poverty, but it needs to be updated, and it needs to be expanded, and it needs to be increased. This rich country that can produce so many multi-billionaires, we can't even increase pensions. And we need not a crazy quilt of pensions here and there. What happens to the danger of our system is, if you have a good union pension, another employer says, well, why should they have a pension? You don't. And they turn workers against workers. Public workers often have taken lower wages. You know, you're a teacher. I don't think you're going to ever be a billionaire being a teacher. And what's happened as public workers start to win better pensions, people start to resent them. Right. That's our tax dollars. I don't have a pension, they do. So whenever you have a benefit that's too skimpy, the labor movement has to fight to expand it for pensions for all.
Again, good old Bernie Sanders has provided political leadership on this front and has offered actual legislation that could serve as a model. before the Butch-Lewis Act, when Teamster retirees were organizing years ago to stop the cuts, they rallied around Bernie's Keep Our Pensions, our Pension Promises Act, or COPA.
As many of you know, Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur and I have introduced legislation that would prevent the retirement benefits of over 1.5 million workers and retirees from being cut by repealing the anti-pension rider in last year's appropriations bill. It establishes an emergency fund within the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation to make sure that multi-employer pension plans can continue to provide every pension benefit owed to every eligible American for decades to come. And we pay for this program by eliminating 2 tax loopholes that impact the wealthiest people in this country. So let me just conclude by thanking you for coming here to D.C. today, for thanking you for standing up not just for yourselves, but for over 1 million workers and retirees all over this country. Bottom line is, if people cannot have faith in government, that government is going to keep their word, then what is our entire democracy about? All right?
Time and time again, the federal government always finds the money to bail out hedge funds and Wall Street and corporate welfare. It is the collective efforts of millions of workers that creates the profits at corporate giants like UPS, Amazon, Walmart, and so many like them. These profits should be taxed to make sure these same workers can retire in dignity. And Jen, I don't know, do you expect a pension?
I don't have, well, I was going to ask you, do you have a pension?
I do, yes. So through my union, we are part of the state pension system. But even, you know, I would say even people in unions my age, you know, I think there's a sense that like by the time we get there, they might have gone away with it. Or, I mean, again, look what happened with the Central States Fund. It was running out of money. If Congress did not step in, again, people were facing literally 60% cuts in their pension. And the average one is $15,000 a year. So a 60% cut to that. So, you know, again, it can't be overstated. This was really important in this relief bill, and it's a huge victory that the Teamsters won.
Yeah, I was just, when I was watching that, I was trying to like think of the people I know who have pensions, the people our age who have pensions, and obviously it's just teachers, you know. But as you say, like even that is a little dicey. But I really liked Ken's point that, you know, it's ridiculous and wasteful and just cruel to expect people to cobble together a retirement from, I think he used the phrase crazy quilt of like different plans and like Social Security, which I think we talk about Social Security on literally every show. We obviously love Social Security. Yeah, somehow it comes up. We love Social Security, but obviously, as Ken pointed out, it's just not enough. And, you know, Bernie Sanders and other politicians have been trying to fix that. But you know, we also hear that, hey, Social Security like might run out soon. So the retirement future is a little apocalyptic.
And just for the record, I mean, a little off topic, but I mean, it's the easiest talking point to respond to the idea that Social Security is going to run out. All you need to do is raise the cap on taxable income very slightly, and Social Security is solvent. That really is all it takes.
Exactly. And I think Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, to her credit, have like pointed that out time and time again. And I know that Bernie wants to make Social Security like even more beefed up, which of course, I mean, we love Bernie. So
I call him Beefy Bernie, you know.
Yeah. I love that clip of him. I feel like every time there's a piece of good legislation, like a low key good legislation, like you kind of dig into it and it's like, oh, there's Bernie.
We could have had a bad one. We could have had a bad Bernie.
Beefy Bernie. So I just want to remind everybody really quickly, we will have Lara Skinner, who is the director of the Worker Institute's Labor Leading on Climate at Cornell University. That's kind of a mouthful, but she will be on in a little bit to talk about just transition, to talk about the Green New Deal, and to talk about some New York specific projects that have to do with building a climate and labor coalition. So I think before we bring her on, I'm just going to talk quickly about some of the issues that have sort of come up around the Green New Deal. So I just want to start by saying, you know, right before the 2020 election, I got access at one of my old jobs to a survey of low-wage workers that was conducted by the polling firm Lake Research Partners and also the group United for Respect. They polled about 1,200 low-wage workers across the US, and this was sort of a one-of-a-kind poll. Most of the time, pollsters don't specifically reach out to low-wage workers, so this was a very unique survey. And what they did is they looked at these workers' support on a number of issues. What they found is that these workers tended to express high levels of support for things like Medicare for all, a $15 minimum wage, and labor unions. However, their response to the idea of a Green New Deal was a little more mixed. So slightly more respondents said they supported rather than opposed a Green New Deal. However, a plurality said they had never heard of the Green New Deal or had no opinion at all on it. Now, if we look at this chart, we can see that around 40% of respondents said that they had not heard of the Green New Deal, compared to only 13% of respondents who hadn't heard of Medicare for all. Now, in some ways, this isn't totally surprising. And if you too are slightly fuzzy on what exactly the Green New Deal is, you're absolutely not alone. For one thing, the Green New Deal has been the subject of a lot of misinformation and conservative ire, including, of course, from Donald Trump, who famously complained that the proposal sought to eliminate planes, cars, cows, and the military.
And here's the deal. He's talking about the Green New Deal, and it's not $2 billion or $20 billion, as you said. It's $100 trillion. I'm talking about where they want to rip down buildings and rebuild the building. No, it's the dumbest, most ridiculous. Where airplanes are out of business, where two-car systems are out, where they want to take out the cows too. You know, that's not true either, right?
So, of course, none of Trump's claims here are accurate, but it is true that the Green New Deal has been the source of a lot of confusion. So, for one thing, it's not a bill, strictly speaking, and here is how Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, of course, is one of the legislation's co-founders, here's how she has explained the Green New Deal.
Our Green New Deal legislation is not a bill. It's a resolution. So there's two different kinds of legislation. And what a resolution does is that if we pass the resolution in the House, it doesn't go into the Senate and it doesn't go to the president. It is a House resolution. It is a declaration. It is an intentional vision document. And what it does is that it puts forward the large scope, the overall vision of what we're trying to accomplish, and to say, listen, if we're going to make progress, we need to declare our North Star, and our North Star is 100% renewable energy. It's Medicare for all. It's tuition-free public colleges. It's investing in technology and renewable resources and electric vehicles. And as a result, any legislation, any actual bills that do follow from that are pieces of that. So you can have one bill that just addresses, battery storage, like Representative Takano out in California. You can have bills that just address infrastructure investment. And so all of those are pieces, but the resolution, the Green New Deal, is the vision of what we need to accomplish in the next 10 years.
So as a resolution, the Green New Deal is unfortunately non-binding, which means that even if Congress eventually approves the Green New Deal, nothing in the resolution would be written into law. But let's take a look at some of the text of the resolution to just get an idea of a few of the guiding planks. So AOC mentioned some of this in her clip, but the Green New Deal includes things like guaranteeing a job with a family-sustaining wage, adequate family and medical leave, paid vacations, and retirement security to all people of the United States. The resolution includes providing resources, training, and high-quality education, including higher education to all people of the United States. The resolution also calls for meeting 100% of the power demand in the United States through clean, renewable, and zero-emission energy sources. And these are just a few of the planks in the resolution. So this is clearly an ambitious and admirable wish list that, again, encompasses not just environmental protections, but also prioritizes workers' rights and economic security for all. Again, as AOC put it, the Green New Deal is a guiding framework and a North Star of sorts for future policy proposals. So to take one recent example, the PRO Act, which recently passed in the House, would effectively end anti-union right-to-work laws and make it easier for workers to organize. So this clearly falls under the Green New Deal framework. And in fact, the Sunrise Movement and other groups have praised the PRO Act as a, quote, core pillar of the Green New Deal. However, that said, it's also the case that to date, the Green New Deal has not been embraced universally by labor unions. So for instance, Richard Trumka, who is the head of the AFL-CIO, initially expressed some reservations about the Green New Deal and specifically pointed out that unions had not been consulted in the drafting of the resolution.
What about the Green New Deal? Do you support that?
Not as currently written.
Oh, really? So you would support something like that, but why do you not support it? Is it too expensive, or you think it's not realistic?
We weren't part of the process. And so the workers' interest really wasn't completely figured into it. So we would want a whole lot of changes made so that workers and our jobs are protected in the process.
Okay.
So obviously, Trumka does not represent the more progressive or the more militant elements of labor. And I do want to mention here that other unions, such as the American Federation of Teachers and also the SEIU, have since endorsed the Green New Deal. However, some of the early tensions around the resolution speak to a longer-running problem, which is that labor and climate justice movements have often clashed in the past. So one recent example of this is the fight over the Keystone Pipeline, which was supported by 4 leading unions, the Laborers International Union of North America, the Teamsters, the International Union of Operating Engineers, and the United Association of Union Plumbers and Pipe Fitters. Now, of course, climate justice groups, indigenous organizers, and progressive politicians, and actually 2 transit workers unions opposed the construction of the Keystone Pipeline on environmental grounds. And then this year, Biden issued an executive order halting the project. Now, this order sparked some pushback again from several labor leaders, including, once again, Richard Trumka, who said the following.
In his first hours as president, Joe Biden announced that he was going to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline. And the Laborers International Union of North America put out a statement saying that it's going to cost 1,000 union jobs. Can you explain why the president was right?
Well, I wish he hadn't done that on the first day, because the Laborers International was right. It did and will cost us jobs in the process. I wish he had paired that more carefully with the thing that he did second by saying, here's where we're creating jobs. We can do mine reclamation, we can fix leaks, and we can fix seeps and create hundreds of thousands of jobs in doing all of that stuff.
So as many on the left have pointed out before, jobs versus the environment is a false dichotomy that conservatives often trot out to undermine climate protections. And I want to be clear, the language in the Green New Deal does explicitly try to bridge this divide by foregrounding a jobs guarantee, a living wage, and retirement security. However, it's also true that many of the environmental groups and politicians that have called for a green economy and a move away from fossil fuels have historically tended to be short on details over how to ensure a so-called just transition for workers who are currently employed in extractive industries. So on the campaign trail, Joe Biden famously suggested that coal miners simply learn how to code. And even some of the more thoughtful calls for a just transition have breezed over the details of how we'll implement this just transition in a country with notoriously thin labor protections and an economy that has already replaced a huge chunk of good-paying middle-class jobs with low-wage service work. So for instance, a pamphlet from Regenerate California, which is a project of the Sierra Club and the California Environmental Justice Alliance, describes a just transition like this. A just transition leaves no worker behind. Workers impacted by climate policies must receive financial assistance, education or training, and a job that provides a family-sustaining wage, healthcare, retirement plans, and a voice on the job. So this is all well and good, but the question is, how will we ensure that workers actually receive those things? Renewable energy jobs currently outnumber fossil fuel jobs 3-to-1, but the catch is that the renewables sector has notoriously few unions and currently pays its workers less than traditional power industry jobs. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, on average, wind technicians and solar installers annually earn $30,000 to $40,000 less than power plant operators. Now, what's more is that the private companies that currently control the wind and solar industries are openly hostile to increased labor protections. So just last month, Joe Biden convened a meeting with a number of unions to discuss strategies for guaranteeing good-paying jobs in the renewables sector. Some of these provisions included things like wage requirements and Buy American requirements. But solar developers and other business leaders in the renewables sector, who are, after all, still trying to turn a profit and also keep their labor costs as low as possible, have opposed these demands. So to return to the PRO Act, a truly just transition to a low or no carbon economy will really only be possible in an environment where strong labor protections already exist. Any climate agenda that glosses over this risks putting the cart before the horse. And since the PRO Act faces an uphill battle in the Senate, we unfortunately can't rely on this legislation alone to resolve the existing tensions between labor and climate justice movements. A working class constituency has to be the foundation rather than an afterthought of the fight for a green economy. As the Professor Matt Huber has recently argued in Catalyst, the Green New Deal as it currently exists would deliver real gains for the majority of Americans if it were implemented. Unlike the type of environmentalism that preaches personal austerity or outright Malthusianism, the Green New Deal is an openly pro-worker agenda of abundance. But while it's a plan for the working class, as of this moment, it's still not a plan of the working class. As Huber writes, the Green New Deal movement is still at its core based in professional class activist networks in academia, NGOs, and think tanks. He continues, if the Green New Deal movement is going to move beyond its professional class activist spaces, it will need to begin building organization and consciousness directly in working class communities, starting in the trade union movement. So we should absolutely commend the climate justice movement for getting more people actively thinking about how to build a sustainable and egalitarian society. Climate activists have, of course, pushed politicians and the public alike to reimagine what our world can look like. And at the same time, because the Green New Deal currently lacks a critical mass of union support, we're still a long way off from having the coalition that we actually need to challenge corporate and capitalist power. The reason why unions are so critical in this fight is not that they're inherently virtuous or that they have more progressive politics than non-union workers. It's that they represent the most effective leverage for working people to advance their interests. So fortunately, there are some signs that this coalition may be starting to form. This, of course, is exactly why we wanted to bring on Lara Skinner, who's been working to build a labor and climate coalition that starts with trade unions as a primary participant in the fight against inequality and climate change, rather than treating unions as a separate constituency that simply has to be convinced to get on board with a climate program. So, I think Lara's going to say more about what that vision will look like, what that vision looks like now, and what the organizing work looks like. And she's going to come on in a few minutes. So I'll wrap up here and let her kind of take that on when we bring her on.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. That was great. And yeah, I mean, that was kind of the perfect warm-up act for Lara. So I don't want to say too much, in response. So I'll introduce Lara, who I'm really excited to have on. So Lara Skinner is the director of the Worker Institute's Labor Leading on Climate initiative at Cornell University. Left are asking now, how do we get workers and unions to support a Green New Deal? How do we get buy-in? So our guest tonight has been in the thick of it, working to do this for many years and having a lot of success. Thank you so much for coming on, Lara.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course.
Great to be here.
So let me start out, I've heard you describe like how the coalition kind of came together in New York in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. Not that there wasn't anything going on, but can you kind of describe like what was the effect of Hurricane Sandy and how this coalition of unions and environmentalists started getting together?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Paul, basically I had done a lot of work with unions around climate change in the past, but I just felt like something really shifted when Hurricane Sandy hit downstate New York and Hurricane Irene hit upstate New York. And it really presented a different opportunity to work with New York unions, and many of whom are the largest union locals in the country. And as you all and probably many of your listeners know, Sandy was a monster historic storm. It did so much damage. We're still trying to rebuild and recover from that storm. People lost their lives. 9 million people lost power, $65 billion worth of damage done. And it just really sort of changed the level of consciousness, I think, among New Yorkers and among the labor movement around climate change, right? It was no longer something of the future, something that's down the road that's going to happen. It's, you know, it's here now. It was really damaging, and we want to do what we can to make sure that we can do as much as we can to avoid future storms like this. And for the labor movement in particular, you really saw a lot of union members on the front lines of dealing with these storms and climate change and extreme weather events, right? You had union members like nurses from the New York State Nurses Association who were carrying patients by hand downstairs because the power was out and elevators weren't working and patients had to be evacuated from buildings. You had transit workers trying to get trains and buses out of flooding's way and, you know, to safety so that they weren't destroyed. You had public sector workers who work at wastewater treatment plants who were stranded at those plants because they were flooded and they couldn't get out. You had utility workers who were trying to repair power lines in really dangerous situations. Schools, right, for the teachers union, schools became shelters in the aftermath of the storm. And, you know, some of you may know that AFSCME DC 37, they were out of their office for over a year because their headquarters sustained so much damage from the storm. So I just felt like it really sort of changed the conversation around climate change and really made it real in a way that it hadn't been before. I think the other key part was that it really exposed and exploited the stark inequality that exists in New York and around the country, right? It was working families, women, communities of color, immigrants, the elderly, who were hurt first and worst, right? It's those who have fewer resources to recover and adapt to climate change and extreme weather events who really sort of bear the brunt of storms like Sandy and climate change in general. And we're just seeing this more and more, right? Like climate change exacerbates existing inequalities. And then the other thing I would say is, you know, coming out of the storm, of course, there was a lot of interest from the environmental and climate justice movements to focus on moving really ambitious climate action in New York State. It made a lot of sense, right? Like we just got hit by this big storm. What is New York State going to do to deal with climate change and reduce emissions? We also, at that same time, started to see a real uptick in solar and wind work. But as you all just mentioned earlier, most of the work's non-union, right? Unionization rate in wind is 4% right now. Unionization rate in solar is 3%. It's even lower in energy efficiency. You look at traditional fossil fuel power generation, coal, oil, and natural gas, we're talking about 10 to 14% unionization rates, right? Quite different. So, you know, what I did is I sort of saw this opportunity. I thought rather than the labor movement being sort of reactive to what the environmental and climate movement is proposing around how to deal with the climate crisis, what if we convened a bunch of unions and thought through what would a positive, proactive, pro-worker, pro-union climate agenda look like? How can we really sort of tackle the challenges that this transition to a low carbon economy is going to present for workers and the labor movement, and also seize the many opportunities we know that are going to be there, right? A lot of studies are saying now we're going to create 25 million jobs in the clean energy economy between now and 2050 to build this climate-friendly economy and to deal with the climate crisis. And so, you know, just in terms of the process, you know, I worked with the New York State AFL-CIO, the building trades, the New York City Central Labor Council, and about 20 local unions to launch this process. It was a multi-year process. It was multi-dimensional and iterative in the sense that we were doing interviews, we were doing research work, we were doing policy development, we were doing training and education with both leaders and members of unions, bringing that all together. And we started at the very beginning, Climate Science 101. What is the climate crisis? What's causing it? What are the impacts that we're seeing? What impacts can we expect to see? What do we need to do to address climate change? How do we reduce emissions, you know, both nationally, but also in New York State specifically? And how do we really do this at the scale and pace that the climate crisis demands? Because that's the big issue, right? We've got some good programs here and there, but most of them are not being done at scale to really sort of deal with the climate crisis and create, you know, significant numbers of jobs. And so we met every few months. By the end of the process, we came up with what we called climate jobs recommendations. I think one of their strengths are that they're very concrete. You We called it a climate jobs program for New York State. And we really sort of went for the sweet spot of how do we get the most emissions reduction? How do we get the most union job creation? What investments do we need to make to build more resilient and equitable communities and support frontline communities that have been most impacted by climate change and environmental injustice? And after we came up with that set of 10 recommendations, the unions that were involved decided to launch their own organization. They sort of said, this is a great idea, great report, but, as good trade unionists, we know that if we're going to win any of these, policy ideas that we've come up with, we've actually got to run campaigns. We've got to run, corporate campaigns, political campaigns, public campaigns, legislative campaigns, and make this climate jobs plan a reality in New York State. And I'm really happy that, because of the success that we've had in New York, a number of the labor leaders that were involved in that work have now gone on to set up something called the Climate Jobs National Resource Center. And we're the academic and educational partner to them and are actually helping coalitions of unions and in some cases, coalitions of unions and environmental groups develop these similar pro-worker, pro-union climate jobs programs.
And as I understand it, it seemed like you were very deliberate about first getting union buy-in first and kind of, I don't want to use the word excluding, but not really worrying about environmental groups necessarily, getting the unions on board first and the buy-in. Can you explain maybe
Yeah, and you're cutting out a little bit, Paul. I don't know if it's something on my end with wireless. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, I think it's just Paul.
Okay, great.
But yes, buy-in from the trade unions first.
Yes, yeah. So, our process was different for a couple of reasons. One, as Paul said, it was a union-only process. We only brought unions together to develop these climate jobs recommendations. The other thing I would say is that we really worked hard to prioritize and center building trade and energy unions in the process. They were the first unions that we sort of recruited into this convening. In the end, it was a very sort of broad coalition representing nearly all the different parts of the labor movement in New York State. But I felt that given the contention over climate issues in the US and around the country in different states, it was really important to dig into the unique challenges that particularly building trades and energy unions face in dealing with the crisis and making this transition. And I just think sometimes you got to do that work within your own house of labor before you can be a better partner and sort of ally to other social movements. And like I said, I think there's just some really unique challenges that unions face in this transition. We can talk more about job loss, and also there's a lot of unique opportunities for labor as we make this transition. And we just really wanted to be able to dig into both of those things. And, as you both know, there's a lot of concern on job loss, as we make this transition. You all mentioned earlier, if you look at the bigger context of our economy in the US and not just talking about climate and clean energy, the vast majority of new jobs that are being created in the US are low wage, precarious jobs. Right? So you think about making a transition right now and you have a high school GED and you're making, over $100,000, have good benefits, and you're talking about your job disappearing, you wonder, is there going to be a job that's just as good to transition to? So I think, there's that, and there's the fact that just transition programs, we've tried them in the past in the US. It's not like this is a new thing. We tried it for, forest workers in the Pacific Northwest when we stopped doing old growth logging. We've tried it for trade affected industries like the steel industry. We had a GI Bill, which was in a form a just transition. And generally, and all of the sort of analysis of these just transition programs in the past have shown they don't have the breadth that they need in terms of reaching the breadth of workers who are really sort of impacted by these economic transitions. They don't provide the depth of support. They're typically not well funded enough to provide the depth of support that workers need. And, ultimately what happens is workers who have lost their jobs don't end up in jobs that pay as much or better than their old jobs, right? They're lower quality jobs. So, and I think the last thing I would say about that is there's a lot of talk among policymakers and within the environmental movement about how many jobs the clean energy economy can create, but it's often pretty superficial in terms of had those jobs actually been created? And often the case is changing a little bit now, but often the case is no, because we're not in climate work at the scale that we need to do it. We're not making the investments in the clean energy economy that we need to see significant levels of job creation. And then the issue of the quality of the jobs that are being created, is not given nearly enough attention. And the reality, as we said before, is that most jobs in solar, wind, and energy efficiency are not good jobs. They're low wage, low quality jobs with few or no benefits. So I think, my thinking was, of course, we've got to build a big, broad, powerful social movement of workers, unions, environmental groups, climate justice groups, racial justice groups, youth organizations, right? The full spectrum to win the more ecologically, socially, racially just economy that we need. But, in terms of this work, I felt like, pulling together a process where the labor movement could really sort of focus on the unique and important challenges and opportunities that they really face in this transition was important for labor being able to develop its own agenda and then eventually be a better partner and ally to the environmental, climate justice, and other social movements around this issue. And I think, the example of the work that the Climate Jobs New York Coalition did around offshore wind is a good one. One of the recommendations that we came up with is that New York State should build 9 gigawatts of offshore wind. That's half of New York's power by 2035, and that there should be a project labor agreement requirement on all of the construction work to make sure that that would create high quality jobs in the construction, and that there would be a pipeline through disadvantaged communities into union pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs supported by that PLA. Mm-hmm. And, Climate Jobs New York decided to make that their focus. And they were able to come out and say to the Sierra Club, other environmental and climate groups, here's what we want to do. We want to go big on offshore wind. We need it to have these labor standards that are going to ensure that these are going to be high quality jobs. And then I think from there, it was a really collaborative effort with labor, enviros, climate justice groups that were able to win that 9 gigawatts with the PLA in New York State.
So I definitely want to get more into the kind of nitty gritty of a just transition in a little bit. But for a second, I want to just zoom out slightly and ask you about the Green New Deal, which obviously we covered a few minutes ago. I think what I find interesting about the Green New Deal is, as I said earlier, there was sort of a mixed reaction from labor, from organized labor to the Green New Deal in the beginning. A little bit of that has changed, but I think also what's interesting about the Green New Deal is that it is in many ways this like unabashedly pro-worker document. So I'm wondering from your perspective, do you see the Green New Deal as a useful framework for kind of bridging some of the like tensions or some of the like disconnects between labor and climate justice as they've existed in the past?
Yeah, I think that the Green New Deal very effectively links the fact that we have a COVID-19 induced economic crisis. We have a highly unequal society. We have a crisis of inequality if you think about income and wealth and race and gender and a whole bunch of other issues. And we have a climate crisis. And I feel like the Green New Deal framing does a really good job of saying we have these major intersecting crises that it makes a lot of sense for us to try to address simultaneously and at scale. I think it's really important. I think, how quickly the transition happens has been a point of contention between some parts of the labor movement and the climate justice movement. And I think, that's not that surprising, for all of the reasons that I just mentioned, right? The fact that just transition hasn't worked in the past, there's not a lot of confidence that that can work, that it will be well funded, that it will be comprehensive and well coordinated, that'll really reach the breadth and depth of workers that it needs to reach. And as long as we're, in a landscape where the vast majority of new clean energy jobs are largely non-union, you can understand why the kind of, the pace of that transition is concerning. And I think, that's really, why I'm doing the work that I'm doing with Climate Jobs New York and the Climate Jobs National Resource Center. We're really focused on how do we advocate for bold, ambitious climate policy and make sure that they're really, dig into the nitty gritty of how do we make sure that there are appropriate equity and labor standards built into this clean energy work from the very beginning so that we can demonstrate that we can create high quality union jobs in these new sectors And I think, as we all know, if we don't do that, we're going to replicate and actually worsen a lot of the inequalities that exist in our current economy and society.
So I guess a follow-up from that is the Climate Jobs New York program that you outlined, is that scalable to a larger or national level? And then I guess following from that, like what are some other kinds of policies or initiatives that can ensure a just transition and can, I guess, guarantee or like at least get green jobs on the road to being good jobs as well? Because I think, probably everybody who is invested in the Green New Deal supports the idea of a just transition. But as you were just saying, it's so much easier said than done.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we are really trying to figure out how we implement solutions that are scalable. I would say, in terms of what we're doing in New York, what's sort of applicable to the national level. I would say like the approach. I think there's a lot in the approach that we have that's really important to take to the federal level. I mean, the way that we think about this work is that we're dealing with two crises, not one, right? We're dealing with a climate crisis and we're dealing with a crisis of inequality, and the solutions have to be taken on both of those things. I think that's like a really key thing. I've done a lot of work with the agencies in different states that are tasked with developing renewable energy and the clean energy economy. And I have to say that a lot of their orientation is that their job is to reduce emissions, and that's solely their job, right? And I think we want to reframe that, right? That we need to build this clean energy economy. Yes, we need to reduce emissions, but we need to do it in a way that's dealing with inequality, that's creating high quality union jobs, that's making investment in frontline communities. So I think that reframing and reorientation is important and really applicable to the federal level. I think the idea of developing recommendations that are really jobs and investment led, right? Like how do we get the most emissions reduction and the most union job creation, and talk about it in a really concrete way, right? You often hear, folks from the traditional environmental movement talking about a 25% reduction below 1990 levels by this date. And I think what we tried to do is talk about how do we get to 100% renewable power, but what does that mean? What do we need to build? How much solar do we need to build? How much wind do we need to build? How much is it going to cost? How many jobs are going to be created? And what sort of labor and wage standards need to be built into that so that we can make sure that these are going to be really good, high quality jobs. And that's what we did in New York. And I think, the other thing that we're really sort of thinking about that's important on the federal level is how do you really sort of use climate policy to drive job creation and economic development? Building offshore wind farms is great. There's going to be a lot of construction work from it. The vast majority of jobs are in the manufacturing and assembly of offshore wind turbines. And so that's like another place where in New York, Climate Jobs New York, the coalition of unions has really been pushing, how do we have targets for how, what percentage of the manufacturing content is going to actually be produced regionally and in a low carbon way, right? How do we secure that? And then how do we have labor peace and neutrality on this, permanent non-construction work so that workers can have a democratic and collective voice on the job? So those are things, if you think about it at the federal level, the agency that oversees offshore wind could be negotiating, to figure out how we're developing a manufacturing supply chain for the offshore wind industry all up and down the East Coast, as you have all of these states that are trying to build offshore wind. And I think a lot of the other recommendations, looking at how do we massively scale up solar and geothermal and heat pumps, how do we build out massive, electric vehicle charging infrastructure? And again, just do all of this with the labor standards that are going to ensure that these are going to be high quality jobs. There's a lot that can be done in public transit, improving and massively expanding public transit. It has like a big equity dimension to it, right? Transit dependent communities need high quality, excellent, reliable public transit systems to get to work, to get to school, to get to other essential things. So, a lot of the things that I think that the policies that we're developing at the state level, I do think are applicable at the federal level, and, with significant funding and with labor standards attached at the federal level, it could go a long way. You asked about, oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, that might have been my computer messing up. But you were kind of anticipating my next question about there's been some recent big developments in New York and New Jersey with offshore wind. Could you talk about like some of the project labor agreements there, how that came about, and what you're kind of looking towards in the future?
Yeah, I mean, so like I said, Climate Jobs New York, one of the recommendations we had developed in our process was to go big on offshore wind. We actually at Cornell organized an educational trip to Denmark so we could learn about the offshore wind industry. We learned quickly from folks in Denmark that the majority of jobs were in the manufacturing and assembly. And that if we were going to have any chance of securing some of those manufacturing operations in the US, we would have to go big on offshore wind, right? Not a few projects here and there, but really saying, let's get half of New York's power from offshore wind. We have a lot of bottlenecks in New York's grid, just north of New York City. Having that offshore wind on the coast and near to our big urban center makes a lot of sense. And so we just felt like this was a good place to focus and really worked hard. Climate Jobs New York did to run a campaign to get that 9 gigawatt target in place and get that project labor agreement. And they're now working on much more comprehensive legislation that would have labor, peace, and neutrality on all permanent non-construction work in the clean energy economy, everything from renewables to electric vehicles to battery storage, prevailing wage on all clean energy work, project labor agreements where public funding is involved. And then again, on the manufacturing piece, how are we mandating that, for example, when New York is evaluating offshore wind proposals, they're looking at which proposals are going to actually do the most manufacturing and job creation in the region. So I think, a lot of great things happening around offshore wind. And after New York included that project labor agreement requirement on their offshore wind construction work, it kind of had a ripple effect. And now we have a whole bunch of states up and down the East Coast who have project labor agreement requirements, prevailing wage requirements, and are looking at developing the manufacturing supply chain. So it's been a good race to the top.
Let me know if I can get in on that trip to Denmark. Just saying.
So I'm curious whether you see, is there a different process for kind of getting buy-in from rank and file workers than there is from sort of talking with union leadership? Because I'm just thinking, like, on a day-to-day level, somebody who works in like fossil fuels, who is now being told like, oh, you're going to go work at this wind plant, like that might be a radically different, just every day, a day at work than they had before. The wind plant might not be near where they live, or like, with solar, it's kind of like, well, like are they going to have to, once they install the solar panels in their area, are they going to have to move or like, commute to really far away to continue doing that work? So I guess, those might not be issues, but those are just like some concerns that I think could pop up, or I think I've heard a lot of the pushback to a kind of, transition to a green economy is sort of like, well, like, are people going to be displaced in a way? So I'm wondering, what your work with kind of getting the buy-in from rank and file workers has been like.
Yeah, I would say two things about this. One is in a way you're asking about the just transition. And I know you'd brought that up before and I didn't quite get to that. I would just like to say on that, I think we have to have a much more coordinated and comprehensive approach to moving from, largely fossil fuel generated energy economy to a, net zero renewables based energy economy. And it's a type of command and control over transition that, you don't typically see, in this particular economic context that we're operating in, right? And particularly in a very deregulated energy market, right? This was very clear in what just happened in Texas. But basically, if you think about, okay, we need to get to, zero emissions by 2045 or 2050, how are we going to do it? In my ideal world, you look at a state, you look at the map of where all of the power plants are, and you look at a whole range of factors to coordinate this transition. Where are the plants? How much power do they produce? How much power is needed in that region? How much emissions and pollution does the plant produce? How does that affect local communities? How many workers work there? What's the quality of those jobs? What kind of skills do those workers have that are translatable to other industries and sectors? What's the tax base of that plant and what's it provide to the local community? We see this a lot with power plants shutting down. A lot of times, if there's a union involved, they can negotiate a pretty good deal for their members, and they may be able to transition them to another power plant someplace else. But it's the local community, right? It's the teachers union, it's the public sector unions that often are most concerned. If you have a power plant that's paying $30 million a year and suddenly it shuts down, that was what was funding your public schools and all of your public services and the jobs connected to them, and the whole sort of ripple of economic benefits there that you lose. I think you really need to look at all of those things and then try to coordinate in the best way to transition in the most equitable way and in the way that is dealing with and addressing the emissions reductions that we need to make, right? Like we need to reduce emissions according to science, but how do we line all of that up? Right now in a deregulated market, you mostly see companies decide when they want to shut down a plant because it's not profitable anymore, and boom, it happens, and you may get a few months notice. Communities and workers need years of notice. They need that long off ramp so that they can plan. If you have to develop a whole new economic activity in that region to support the local community, that takes time. There's that. And then really digging in, what are the skills that workers currently have in these sectors that may eventually close down? And what are the very specific skills that are going to be needed in some of these new parts of the clean energy economy? And there's just a lot of workforce development that has to happen there that I think is really important. The last thing I would say about in terms of speaking with members. So part of what we do with our work is we're developing these climate jobs plans in each state. After the coalition of unions decide what their agenda is, what they're going to focus on, for example, in New York, offshore wind, the next phase of that for us is to develop a training for union members, right? So that they can really understand, why are we talking about the climate crisis as a labor movement? What's that got to do with us? How is it going to impact our industries, our workplaces, our communities and families? What are the challenges here? Where are the opportunities? Where could this potentially produce jobs that I'm going to see, right? Going to Denmark is really helpful for plumbers and pipe fitters to get inside of a turbine and see, oh, there's a 2-person elevator in these turbines, and oh, these are the heat pump systems, right, that I would be working on. That's really important. We have designed, even among COVID, basically after New York committed to build all of these offshore wind projects, you still have to go through a lot of local siting issues, right, for these projects actually to get built. And so we realized it would be so important for the 250,000 union members who are on Long Island to be able to show up at public hearings, to reach out to legislators and say, we support these offshore wind projects because we think it's going to deal with the climate crisis. It scales up New York's renewable power, and we see a lot of jobs and economic benefits for us in this work. And so we've been rolling out a 90-minute virtual training with members in Long Island in conjunction with Climate Jobs New York to really dig into, why is the labor as the labor movement is important for us to work on climate change, and specifically what are the opportunities in offshore wind for members. And we tailor depending on which union we're working with too.
So I want to follow up on that by asking a question about what I think is a slightly controversial energy sector, which is nuclear, because the Green New Deal kind of has a benchmark of 100% renewable, and I think that you had mentioned that for Climate Jobs New York as well. So I'm wondering how you see nuclear sort of fitting into that, because I think with 100% renewables, we hear a lot of labor leaders saying, well, this isn't really realistic. And then the other sort of aspect with the nuclear workers is that they are highly unionized, or have relatively high union density. So I'm just wondering how you see kind of nuclear fitting into a just transition.
Yeah. That's a good question. And I would say, I think my answer is pretty similar to the answer that I just offered on just transition, in the sense that I just think that we need to look at what is it going to take in each state and region to transition to 100% renewables. And in some places, if there is heavy reliance on nuclear right now, and there's the potential to quickly scale up solar and wind to replace, coal or oil or natural gas generation, we're going to have a lot on our hands just to do that. And we should do it as quickly as possible. And it may be that keeping that nuclear fleet, particularly if it's creating a lot of jobs, they're high quality jobs, it's providing a lot of tax base for local communities. That's why I say, like, looking at all of that stuff, I think is so important to really sort of thinking through how this transition should happen and how it's going to impact workers and communities, but also how do we move as quickly as possible to get to 100% renewables. And I think, what we're seeing most recently in the US over the last couple of decades is we're not seeing new nuclear plants being built because solar and wind power has gotten so much cheaper, right? And so, why would investor-owned utilities be building new nuclear when they know they can build new solar and wind, and it's going to be cheaper and they're going to see more profit from it? So I just think that's the reality. And then, of course, there's all sorts of other issues around the nuclear waste. We're seeing, after Fukushima, you see a lot of public opposition. So, again, I think have a comprehensive, coordinated approach to how we do this transition, get to 100% renewables as fast as possible, figure out what nuclear's role is in it, and then also, kind of look at what's happening in the energy market more broadly.
So let's turn to the Biden administration. How would you assess generally how Biden's doing with green jobs, like how he's talking about it, how he's approaching it? And along with that, do you think someone like Marty Walsh as Secretary of Labor with a background in the building trades might be able to help facilitate some of this buy-in a little bit more?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, from my perspective, I thought Biden, throughout the primary of the election, kept moving sort of left on how he was prioritizing climate work, the level of ambition with which he was talking about the U.S. approaching it. I think that's really good. I think, centering, addressing the climate crisis as a crucial part of how we recover from the COVID-19 crisis is really great. New York had passed the Climate Protection and Community Leadership Act in the last legislative session. That says 40% of climate investments should go to workers who are impacted by this transition and frontline communities. And Biden really sort of moved to that same place, which I think is really important. And I think as we recover from COVID-19, we certainly do not want to be, investing in a whole bunch of infrastructure that is not climate safe, right? That's not building the 21st infrastructure that we need to deal with climate change. So I think that's really important. I also think he's the first president, I think, that we've had in a long time that is really willing to speak out about the importance of unions and regularly talk about the importance of creating union jobs. And I think he's, really gone sort of strong in tackling the climate crisis and building the clean energy economy with creating union jobs. And I actually think, we may have a better shot at securing labor standards attached to all clean energy work at the federal level than we do more broadly. I mean, that may be the place where we can win some significant, upgrades and protections for organizing and other wage standards. So, so I think, he seems to be focusing on how do we maximize the job creation and economic development potential of climate work, particularly around electric vehicles. He's really looking at how do we encourage union manufacturing of electric vehicles and doing the same for offshore wind. I think his administration is in a really good place to look at how do we leverage the high level of interest in offshore wind up and down the East Coast. I mean, really, it's from Maine to North Carolina that we now have states saying we're going to be building offshore wind. How do you leverage that at the federal level and be really looking at how we secure, the manufacturing and assembly work in the U.S. that would be so beneficial from a jobs perspective?
So on the subject of Biden, the kind of controversy around the Keystone XL pipeline bubbled up again earlier this year because Biden issued an executive order kind of halting the construction. And then, some labor leaders sort of pushed back on that. And I guess, so it seems like, pipelines, fracking, and of course coal have kind of they're sort of held up as like the quintessential jobs versus environment sort of tension. And I'm wondering if you think that that's overblown, or if you think that there's actually more cooperation between, the traditional labor movement and the climate justice movement that doesn't get as much media attention.
I think there's a tremendous amount of collaboration happening between the labor movement and the traditional environmental movement, as well as environmental and climate justice groups. I feel like in every place that we're working, every state that we're turning to, there's some form of labor enviro coalition. We've seen such a tremendous appetite from the labor movement to work on these issues and to figure out what's their really sort of bold, ambitious climate plan, and how do we really integrate it with strong labor standards so that they know we're going to build this clean energy economy and it's going to be built with good jobs. So I see, a lot more appetite from the labor movement to work on these issues. And I think, and a lot of good work happening. I mean, I mentioned, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in New York. That was, a broad coalition of unions, enviros, and climate justice groups, community groups, renewable energy advocates who worked on that. And it's a pretty great bill. It didn't, in the end, it didn't have the labor standards that it should have had in it. And I think, folks are now working to kind of rectify that. But there's other examples, right? There's other examples of where this type of collaborative work is happening. And again, like I said before, as long as we have, this legitimate fear that we do not have a well-funded, well thought out, just transition program that's going to support workers. And as long as we continue to see most of the job growth in the renewable sector be non-union, we're gonna have these tensions.
So I think our last question is, what is the Cornell Labor Institute? I think a lot of our viewers would be curious to know more about that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for asking. So the Worker Institute at Cornell, we're part of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. We were set up by the New York State Legislature in the late 1940s. And we were set up to provide training and education programs to unions. We've been doing that since the late 1940s. When we launched the Worker Institute in 2012, we basically said, we want to kind of refocus our work on what we think is the most important work that we can be doing with the labor movement today. And we decided to focus on gig work. We decided to focus on gender and racial justice issues in the workplace. We decided to focus on leadership development, and we decided to focus on labor leading on climate. And we looked at all of those things, like with the climate crisis, and said, this is one of the most important, if not the most important social issue of our time. And we can be a tremendous resource to the labor movement to study the labor and employment impacts of climate change, and then provide direct training and education programs to workers around this issue. And so that's what we do. We advance workers' rights and collective representation. We try to reverse inequality by building a stronger labor movement, and we're really committed to building a broad, inclusive, diverse, dynamic, and powerful labor movement.
Awesome, Lara. Well, that was great. And again, I think people really have gotten a lot out of this and hearing some concreteness to this idea of a Green New Deal and just transition.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Lara. And I really encourage everyone to go to Climate Jobs New York's website. That report you talked about, when I first saw it, was incredible. And I felt like every single state needed to do that, because they really lay out exactly how many jobs are going to be created, the average wage. And I think that is what's really needed, is a real concrete plan to show that this could be real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we have been talking about this problem basically for the whole show, but I think the idea of a just transition is obviously something that everybody supports, but actually seeing what that will constitute is like another thing entirely. So it was great to have Lara on to kind of lay that out and explain what that actually means, and have a success story to show for it.
Right. Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
So speaking of labor,
Speaking of labor, it is now time for LaborPaul. Just to remind everybody who's watching, Paul answers labor-related questions every time he's on the show. We take a new batch of questions every time. If you have any questions, pop them in the comments or in the chat. Let's roll out the first one.
All right.
Oh, this is a good one. So Michael, this was a comment on YouTube, wants to know, how do we expand the power of OSHA?
Yeah, this is a great one. And if there's ever a time that highlighted the importance of an agency like OSHA, which stands for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, it's now. And OSHA was created in 1971, and its funding and staffing has been cut and under attack ever since the Reagan years. But with Trump, it's gone to a whole new level. And under his administration, the number of inspectors fell to its lowest levels in the entire agency's existence. Workplace deaths have been on the rise. The former OSHA chief under Obama, David Michaels, said that OSHA has been missing in action during the COVID crisis, which I think is true. And Trump also passed some executive orders that, ended the requirement of some large companies to keep records of injuries and deaths in the workplace for OSHA. And so I think there are a few levels to this answer. And so first, in the immediate future, we need to stop the cuts to OSHA and dramatically expanded resources in terms of funding and staffing. But there's a flaw with OSHA that I think goes deeper than that. And the agency was set up as an attempt to respond to the dangerous ways that employers organize production, instead of an effort from the state to intervene in the productive process from the start, to eliminate hazards that are built into the production process itself. And so it's also relied on executive power for enforcement, which has also allowed it to be undermined. I mean, as early as the Ford and Carter presidencies, they were making new OSHA standards prove that they wouldn't negatively impact the budget and cause inflation. Or in other words, they wouldn't make corporations spend too much money that they didn't want to spend. And I think we can really see the limits of OSHA if we compare it to the workplace health and safety standards achieved in Sweden during the heyday of their social democracy in the 1970s. And so in Sweden, occupational safety and health standards were negotiated between the major union federations, the Worker Protection Board, which was their version of our OSHA, and the employer organization. And their Worker Protection Board had a lot much more power than OSHA has. Legal challenges by employers were not even allowed to their protection board. And so there were some laws passed in the mid-70s and late 70s that gave workers, the right to know about hazards, to supervise the operation of in-plant services, and to refuse to do hazardous work. And they also gave worker representatives a permanent majority on the health and safety committees inside the workplace. And so this all speaks to, I think, the broader point that getting true workplace health and safety reform is not really going to come through an agency. It comes through workplace power. And they reached those heights in Sweden because their labor movement was extremely powerful. They had over 70% union density. I'll repeat, 70% compared to the peak in the United States, which was 37%. And workers had the political power in the form of a Social Democratic Party or a Labor Party to pass those laws. And even before we get to the place where we can pass better laws, I think we can start improving workplace safety by having strong unions and enforce it on the shop floor. So the great union organizer, Tony Mazzocchi, worked with the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. And so he dealt with a lot of workplace hazards. And he used to say that really safety laws were meaningless, even though he was one of the leaders of the movements to create OSHA. But his point was that at the end of the day, what you need is to make every worker an expert on health and safety in the plant so they can enforce it. So in the short term, we need to defend and expand OSHA, yes. But I mean, ultimately, what we need to do is build working class power so that we can actually start intervening in the production process itself to prevent these hazards from appearing. And that, of course, is a lot harder.
So 2 quick things. One, I read that Tony Mazzocchi was the one who coined the phrase just transition. And 2,
True.
I think like what you're just saying about, labor power or like labor unions being kind of the heart of getting this shit done goes back to why labor unions are so important for a Green New Deal, I think.
Right. And on Mazzocchi, I mean, I just got to say this. I mean, if we build socialism, we need like a statue of him in our main city. He was an incredible union leader. I really highly recommend people read the book, The Man Who Hated Work and Loved Labor by Les Leopold about Tony Mazzocchi. It's truly one of the best political books I've ever read.
I feel like also what you just said was a kind of classic Bernie. Like, how are we going to do this? Denmark, Sweden.
Right. The millionaires and billionaires.
Yeah. All right. Let's get to the next LaborPaul question. So another YouTube commenter writes, I work at a large agricultural company and am represented by UAW, which is currently plagued by corruption scandals at the highest level. How can workers fight huge multinational companies without the backing of large union organizations that act like businesses? The dreaded union business boss.
Yeah. And, in the last show I got a similar question about teachers unions, how to reform teachers unions. And I think I'm going to give a similar answer to this one. And that is that you'll have to engage in a process of trying to reform your union, which is very difficult and it's a very long-term project, but there kind of is no shortcuts beyond that. And there have been some interesting developments in the UAW, which is United Auto Workers, that you should follow. And so in December, actually, the UAW leadership, which for others that don't know, and what the person is, referring to, is there was a big corruption scandal at the top of the UAW. But in December, the leadership reached a settlement with the Justice Department that kind of opens the door to possibility of a direct election of top officers by referendum vote in September. And so this could open things up and I think allow some reformers at the national level and the local level to gain substantial power. And a similar change was actually made in the previous interview with Ken Paff. He was actually instrumental in forcing these changes through. But a similar change was made to the Teamsters election process in the 1980s, where members were finally allowed to vote directly for their national officers instead of doing it through delegates. And that led to a reformer winning the presidency in 1991 of the Teamsters, Ron Carey, and he led a historic nationwide UPS strike in 1997. So all that's to say is that, it kind of sounds like a bureaucratic change, but that can lead to big changes in the union in a relatively short period of time. So I think, what you can do is try to involve yourself in this process. I mean, encourage your coworkers, other UAW members to vote in this referendum that's coming up about whether they want direct election of officers. And that conversation can open the door to, what they think is wrong with the union, what they want to improve, what they want to win at work. And that alone is not going to solve everything, being able to elect the top leaders. And like I said about, teachers unions, is that taking back your union might involve forming caucuses at the local and national level that involve members in fighting the company and provide a different model of how the union could be. So I would say, definitely keep an eye on these changes that are happening at the national level with the UAW, involve yourself in them. Beyond that, again, it's not going to be a short, easy fight, but there is a way to reform a union. Again, even if you think it's hopeless, it's happened time and time and time again, but it is a long-term process.
I got nothing to add on internal union politics.
It is interesting though, because UAW, I think some viewers will know of Walter Reuther, famous labor leader, was also part of that progressive labor alliance of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. The civil rights, March on Washington was like bankrolled partly by the UAW, and that was partly thanks to Walter Reuther. But the UAW actually used to be a really great model of democracy in the union, because they had so many different caucuses at their conventions. There was like 3 or 4, including like a really far left-wing one. Also, many caucuses based on race that weren't happening in many other unions. So it's kind of ironic that these days it's totally now been closed down. But I think, with these changes at the top that kind of unfortunately were forced through this corruption scandal, I think it could open up to like there being a more vibrant internal culture in the unions like there used to be. And, they've so many unions have gotten out of the practice in it. Like I deal with this in my own union where, people have been used to there not being an alternative caucus, that like they see it almost as like you're a union buster, believe it or not. If you're like in this caucus where it's like, no, I mean, it's just like a political system, you don't want a one party state, that's a sign of a vibrant culture to have, multiple caucuses or multiple parties.
I forgot you're very pro caucus in the union.
Well, yeah, it depends. It's all case by case. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that is our last LaborPaul question for tonight. So once again, if you have any follow-up questions for Paul or any new labor questions that you have, go ahead and drop those in the chat or in the comments, and we'll get to them next time Paul's on.
All right.
I think on that note, have a good night, everybody, and we will see you next week.
Yep. And happy St. Patrick's Day, if that's
Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Right. Bye, everyone.